Hi, I'm Venora. My family erased me before I even knew I belonged. They told the world I was a mistake, the poor girl from nowhere who married beneath her class. What they didn't know was the man they mocked was the man their empire would fall for. Last night, in front of hundreds of guests, they laughed at me. And then he walked in. One sentence, just one, and everything they built began to crumble. So let me ask you, have you ever been treated like you were nothing, only to realize maybe you were the most dangerous thing in the room all along? Before we dive in, what time are you listening to this? And where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. The gravel crunched under the tires of the black town car as it rolled up the circular driveway. I sat in the back seat, fingers curled into my clutch, heart steady but heavy. The mansion was exactly as I imagined, white columns, slate roof, and a perfectly trimmed lawn that screamed old money, the kind of wealth that doesn't need to flaunt itself, the kind of wealth I never had. I adjusted the collar of my dress, exhaled through my nose, and stepped out. There were people everywhere. Men in tailored suits laughing into flutes of champagne, women in silk gowns barely concealing their judgment, the clink of glass, the hum of idle gossip, the perfume of roses and entitlement. It all hit me at once. 32 years. That's how long it had been since they gave me away. My heels clicked against the stone walkway as I followed a staff member toward the entrance. No one looked at me long enough to recognize me, at least not yet. I wasn't wearing anything flashy, simple black, clean makeup, hair pulled back. I didn't want to make a statement. I just wanted to be present. Inside, it was even grander. Gold-trimmed mirrors. Chandeliers that looked like they could pay off student loans for an entire county. I felt like a tourist inside a life that should have been mine. Then it started. A woman holding a clipboard approached. Name? Venora Carr. She scanned the list and handed me a place card. You'll be seated at table 14. I looked down. My name was misspelled, Verona, like the city, not the woman. Something about that hurt more than I expected, not because they got it wrong, but because they didn't bother to get it right. Table 14 was near the back of the ballroom, beside the restrooms. I passed rows of polished people and crisp linens. Table 1 had place cards written in gold calligraphy. Table 14 had water stains. I sat quietly. One of the staff came by with wine. I declined, my stomach was twisting. And then, he came. Orville. Same smirk, older face. He looked exactly how I remembered him. A snake in a suit. He leaned over the table and said, loudly enough for others to hear, "Well, well, well, look who finally crawled out of whatever ditch she's been hiding in." A few chuckles from neighboring tables. Not full laughter. More like polite acknowledgments that cruelty is still a language spoken fluently in rooms like this. He straightened his tie and added, "Who even knows what kind of woman she is now? Or what kind of man she married?" I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just watched him. Because sometimes, silence cuts deeper than words. People shifted in their seats, unsure whether to laugh again or look away. I stayed seated. Still, small, observing. He walked off like he'd just won a game only he was playing. And in that moment, I felt it. The old ache. The invisible tether pulling me back into the same place I'd spent years escaping. The feeling of not belonging, not being enough. I wasn't even angry, not yet. I was numb. Like the part of me that expected kindness had quietly resigned. The rest of the dinner passed in fragments. Small talk at the table, awkward glances. No one asked how I was. No one noticed I hadn't touched my food. I wasn't there to eat. A woman beside me whispered, "That's her, the lost daughter." Like I was a missing earring, but I stayed. I needed to see it through. I needed to know why they brought me back after all this time. Was it guilt? A performance? Or worse, curiosity? I glanced at the clock. He was late. Draven was supposed to be here by now. I'd told him not to come if it jeopardized the summit, but he promised, if anything happens, I'll be there. Just say the word. I hadn't said the word. Not yet. And I didn't need him to save me. At least that's what I told myself. I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes for half a second, and remembered being 11, sitting alone on a metal bench while the social worker signed the release forms. No one came. No one called. They had erased me with a signature and a silence, and now, here I was, reinserted into their lives like nothing ever happened. I opened my eyes, looked around the room, and knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to cry. And I damn sure wasn't going to let them write this chapter of my story. Not this time. I held that name card in my lap like it was evidence. Verona. Wrong by just one letter, but completely off the mark. Funny how one small slip could feel like a punch to the gut. Not just a typo, no. It felt like a reminder that even now in this house filled with people who shared my blood, I still didn't belong. A waiter walked by and offered a glass of champagne to the woman next to me, but didn't even glance my way. I wasn't invisible. I was deliberately ignored. It was as though everyone had silently agreed. Don't look too long. Don't ask too much. She's only here for the show. I adjusted the card again, smoothing the edges with my thumb. I don't know why I didn't throw it away. Maybe because part of me knew it would matter later. Ladies and gentlemen, came a voice over the speaker system. Please join me in welcoming our beloved goddaughter Verona, who has returned to us after so many years. I froze. Goddaughter. There was a ripple in the room, a pause, then gasps, a few heads turned. Then came the whispers, slick as oil on water. I thought she was their real daughter. No way. Must be a charity case. I heard she was adopted out years ago. Probably came crawling back for money. They didn't even try to whisper quietly. I felt my stomach churn, not just from the words, but from the intent behind them. That announcement wasn't a mistake, it was strategy. It stripped me of my place without ever having to say the words out loud. I wasn't introduced as their daughter. I was introduced as an outsider, one with no legal claim, no emotional anchor, just a guest, a convenient story to tell. I sat up straighter, trying to focus on breathing. 1, 2, 3. Inhale. Don't let them see it shake you. A server approached with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. You want one, miss? I nodded, grateful for the distraction. He handed me a napkin and leaned in, almost in a whisper. Hang in there. They don't deserve you. I didn't know who he was. Maybe just a kind soul who'd seen this kind of thing too many times, but his words hit me harder than I expected. A tiny thread of human decency buried under layers of silk and pretense. Just as I was taking a breath, I heard the clink of a glass being tapped. I looked toward the sound. Orville stood, grinning like a man who'd just gotten away with something ugly. Let's raise our glasses, he said, voice loud and smug. To Verona, who somehow found her way home after 30 years. Better late than never, right? The laughter that followed wasn't full-blown, but sharp and knowing, the kind that hurts because it wears a smile. Lucasta, my sister, chimed in sweetly. Well, at least she has something to bring to the table, I hope. I met her eyes across the room. She didn't blink. Neither did I. They were testing me, prodding, seeing how far I'd let them go. My throat tightened. My hands curled into fists beneath the tablecloth. I could have stood up right then, could have called them out in front of everyone. But I didn't, because deep down I understood something. If I cracked now, they'd win. They'd get to call me unstable, emotional, weak. They'd get to confirm whatever lie they'd whispered about me in their wine-soaked circles. No, I wasn't going to give them that. I forced my hands to relax, picked up the name card again. Verona. Let them have their laugh. Let them misname me, misplace me, misjudge me, because I knew who I was, even if they didn't. And I knew Draven was coming. They didn't. Not yet. The rest of the evening passed like a dull blade, slow and painful in all the right places. People stopped by to say hello, not out of kindness but curiosity. Most of them didn't remember me at all. One woman patted my arm and said, "You poor thing. Must be so overwhelming for you. Like I was a rescue dog." By dessert, my cheeks ached from fake smiling. My back hurt from holding in every emotion I wanted to release. I kept quiet not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much to let them see me break. I glanced again at the name card. One day, I thought, this won't define me. One day, they'll remember what they did. And one day, I won't have to say a word, they'll know. Their words that night echoed against the walls of my memory, louder than the music, louder than the laughter. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, eyes on the flickering candle at the center of the table. The flames moved gently with the air conditioning, like it wasn't aware it was surrounded by snakes. Orville's smug little toast kept playing on a loop in my head. Better late than never. And Lucasta's voice, too, syrupy sweet but soaked in poison. At least she has something to bring to the table, I hope. I lowered my gaze and stared at the misprinted card again. Verona. That name didn't belong to me, but neither, it seemed, did this family. I could feel the blood pulsing in my temples, a dull reminder that I was very much alive, even if they wanted me to disappear again. Funny thing is, this wasn't new. This wasn't the first time I'd been mislabeled, misjudged, shoved into the shadows. It took just one breath, and I was back there again. A kid, maybe 7. Sitting cross-legged on the floor of a foster home in Queens, listening as a woman told her friend on the phone, "She's the quiet one, keeps to herself, barely knows how to talk to people." That became my name for a while. The quiet one, never Venora, not even sweetheart. I was background noise in every house I lived in, never the daughter, never the favorite, just the obligation. I remembered one birthday where my foster parents forgot, then told me it wasn't a big deal because I wasn't really family. They gave their biological son a party the next weekend, with balloons and a magician. I got a stale cupcake 2 days later. No candle. Sitting there back in the ballroom, I realized something painful. What they were doing to me tonight wasn't just cruelty. It was a reminder. A perfectly orchestrated performance designed to reopen the wounds they knew I'd spent my life covering. And it was working. I almost stood up. Almost gathered my things, walked out the same door I came in, and never looked back. The kind of exit that leaves no space for regret. But then I saw him. Orville. Across the room, talking to a guest but watching me out of the corner of his eye. He was smiling. It wasn't a grin. It was satisfaction, like he was checking a box. Humiliate her. Done. I stayed seated, because if I left now, that grin would stretch wider, and he'd go on telling people, "See, she couldn't handle it, knew she didn't belong." No, not this time. I stayed. I took another slow sip of water, dry as chalk, and told myself, wait, watch. Understand the game they're playing before you decide how to flip the board. That's when I noticed it. Lucasta, whispering something into Orville's ear, both of them chuckling like they had just shared a private joke. It wasn't just them being awful. It was coordinated, calculated. There was something more going on here than bad manners. They weren't just mocking me for fun. They were setting me up. Across the room, a woman in a red dress leaned in to the man beside her and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "She doesn't belong here. She's an embarrassment." That was it. That was the blow I didn't see coming. From a stranger. Someone who didn't even know me, but still felt entitled to decide where I did or didn't belong. My fingers tightened around the edges of my chair, knuckles white. I forced myself not to react, not to let the burn behind my eyes spill over. But something inside shifted. I didn't feel like crying. I felt like burning. I looked around the room. Gold chandeliers, sparkling gowns, men in cufflinks pretending to be gentlemen. And I saw it for what it really was. A circus. A performance where I was cast as the mistake they hoped would quietly exit stage left. But I wasn't going anywhere. Not until I understood what game they were playing. And why. I remembered something my last foster mother used to say when I sat on the porch with her after school, watching cars go by. Quiet water cuts deeper than waves. She meant it as a comfort that people like me, who didn't shout, who didn't demand the spotlight, could still change the world. Quietly, slowly, permanently. That line came back to me now. Not like comfort, but strategy. I wouldn't scream, I wouldn't cause a scene, but I would let this burn grow. I'd feed it with every insult, every smirk, every whisper behind a napkin, because this time I wouldn't be invisible. Not even for them. The first chance to strike back came sooner than I expected. The ballroom hadn't changed. Chandeliers glowing like stars trying too hard, violins humming over forced laughter. But something in me had... My chest no longer felt heavy with shame. It felt tight with restraint. I didn't want to survive this night anymore. I wanted to own it. The waiter refilled my glass without looking me in the eye. Again. My name was still wrong on the place card. Still, no one had corrected it, or cared. Across the table, Lucasta raised her flute of champagne, and just like that, the air shifted. "To family," she said, with a smile so polished it cut. "To the strength of blood and the bonds that never break. To those who were there from the beginning, who never left, never forgot, never wandered off only to return when the lights were bright." A soft chorus of "hear, hear" followed from the guests, too polite not to respond, too gutless to question what they just heard. She didn't say my name, but she didn't have to. I didn't flinch. I didn't roll my eyes or drop my fork. I simply looked up and met her gaze. Steady, cold. Her smile faltered, just slightly, and that was enough for me to taste the beginning of something different in the back of my throat. I stood. It wasn't dramatic. No clinking of glass, no clearing of throat. I didn't ask for attention. The room gave it to me all on its own. "Thank you," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. It means a lot to be welcomed as a guest in the house where I was born. You could hear the breath catch in at least a dozen throats. Someone dropped a knife. Another coughed. Lucasta's expression didn't change, but the sparkle in her eyes dulled just enough for me to feel it. That was the first crack, the tiniest break in their little show. I sat down again, calm, like nothing had happened. But it had. I felt it behind me. The ripple. A few minutes passed. People began to chat again, some more cautiously. The clinking resumed, and the violins returned to their waltz. But there was a shift now, a slight unease. They'd seen something unexpected. The girl they'd written off wasn't so easily erased. And right on cue, Orville leaned in from the next table. "Who knows what kind of man she married," he said with a smirk, not bothering to lower his voice. It landed exactly where he wanted, halfway between a jab and an invitation for laughter. And laugh they did. I didn't take the bait. I didn't say a word. I didn't defend Draven. Not yet. The air around the table thickened with anticipation. I felt their eyes flick toward me, waiting for the meltdown, the tears, the denial. I gave them nothing. Let them laugh. Let them pretend he was some nobody, some truck driver or security guard I'd clung to out of desperation. They'd know soon enough. My silence tonight wasn't about weakness. It was about timing. But I saw something then that gave me pause. Orville whispering to one of his old prep school buddies, a man with slicked back hair and a too white smile. Then to another across the table. A glance from him, a nod from Lucasta. They weren't just tossing around casual cruelty, they were planning something. Maybe they were worried about the will, or the board, or the press. Maybe they knew something was coming, something I didn't yet, and they were scrambling to undermine me first. The thought sharpened me. I needed to stay still. Stay quiet. For now. Not because I was scared, but because I wanted to know what cards they were playing before I laid down mine. The sound of a waiter opening a bottle of wine broke my train of thought. I glanced around, faces blurred into one another, polite smiles, glazed eyes, half-finished desserts. But under it all was the same thread. I wasn't one of them. Yet I was. And I would not let them rewrite that. They thought I was too fragile to fight back, but soon they would choke on their own words. Their laughter was fading, but something heavier lingered in the air. That stillness before another blow lands. I sat straighter, my fingers tracing the stem of my glass, aware that every glance, every smirk across the table held a purpose. Lucasta leaned over her wine, swirling it slowly, the ruby liquid catching the chandelier's glow. "Children mirror their mothers," she said, tossing the words like crumbs to a circling crowd. Some guests chuckled politely, others shifted in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or stay neutral. And then Orville, always the one to twist the knife just a little deeper, said it, loud enough for the room to catch. "She probably doesn't even know which side of the family she belongs to." I didn't need to turn to see the look on my daughter's face. I felt it, that quiet crumbling in her chest, the ache of being singled out in a room full of strangers. She lowered her eyes, her hand frozen mid-reach for her fork. I knew that stillness well. I'd worn it my entire childhood. Every instinct in me surged to stand, to call them out, to break the silence with the fury they deserved. But then, I looked at her. My child. My heart in human form. She wasn't crying. Not yet. She was trying so hard not to make a scene. Just like I once did. So I did what I never thought I could again. I swallowed the scream in my throat, let it burn its way down. My fists clenched under the table, nails pressing crescents into my palms, grounding me. I leaned gently toward her, my voice just above a whisper. "Never let them define you," I said. "They want a reaction. Don't give it to them." She glanced at me then, her lower lip trembling, but she nodded. That was enough. I straightened in my chair, raised my glass not in celebration but in subtle defiance. "Some families build legacies on cruelty," I said, calm and clear. "But real strength isn't inherited. It's chosen." The room stilled. A few glasses paused mid-air. One of the women, someone's third wife, I vaguely remembered, shifted in her seat uncomfortably. Orville's fork tapped his plate. The tension bounced through the room like a dropped knife. Lucasta's smile faltered. Not much, but I saw it. That half-second twitch at the corner of her mouth. The cracks were beginning to show. Orville leaned in, voice low, but not low enough. "Still hiding behind words, Venora. Some things never change." I met his gaze. And some people never evolve. The guests didn't laugh this time. They didn't even pretend to. A few stared into their drinks. A man near the far end, maybe one of Orville's business contacts, rubbed the back of his neck like he'd suddenly remembered an important call he needed to make. Lucasta, regaining her footing, forced a tight chuckle. "Well," she said, lifting her glass with renewed cheer, "families are complicated, aren't they? But we're all here now. That's what matters." I didn't respond. Let her scramble for normalcy. Let her paint over the cracks I'd just opened. Orville leaned closer to Lucasta. He whispered, but not well enough. I caught fragments. "Backfire. Draven's absence. Let's push harder." Draven. They thought his absence made me vulnerable. They thought his silence meant weakness. I almost laughed. If they only knew. I looked across the table at my daughter. Her eyes met mine again. Steadier now. She hadn't touched her food. Her fingers still trembled slightly, but her spine was straighter. She was watching me, learning, not just about them, about strength, about choice. This wasn't just about me anymore. "You okay?" I asked her gently. She nodded, but whispered, "Why are they like this?" "Because they're afraid," I wanted to say. "Because people like them build walls from money, and they think it protects them from truth." "They need to feel powerful," I said instead. "That's all this is. Noise." She nodded again, slowly. Wiser now, older than a few minutes ago. A server passed by with more champagne. I declined. My glass was full, and I'd made my toast. The evening continued. Forced laughter, clinking glasses, conversations that meant nothing. But something had shifted. I could feel it. They saw me now. Not as the misplaced guest near the restroom, not as the mistake they'd buried for decades, but as someone standing, quietly, clearly, with no intention of being erased again. Orville's confidence thinned as he watched me. He was used to women folding, to being the loudest voice in the room. He didn't know how to handle silence when it held weight. Lucasta retreated into idle chatter with a woman beside her, but she kept glancing my way. Her grip on her wineglass grew tighter each time she did. They weren't unraveling yet, but they would. I turned to my daughter once more, brushed a hair from her face. "You did good," I told her. "So did you," she replied, voice soft but proud. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just my story anymore. Every word I chose, every insult I absorbed and redirected, she was watching, learning, becoming. And they were watching too, realizing. The girl they discarded wasn't leaving quietly. The woman they ignored had returned, not to beg, but to expose. And if they thought they could break me by breaking her, they had just made their most dangerous mistake. And that night, I decided silence alone would no longer be enough. There comes a point when silence doesn't protect you. It just gives your enemies more room to speak for you. I'd sat through their jabs, their toasts, their venom wrapped in velvet. I'd absorbed it all, hoping to protect my daughter from the worst of it. But when Orville turned his attention to the one person I loved more than life itself, something inside me shifted. That shift didn't fade. It hardened. Orville wasn't finished. The clinking of silverware softened as he raised his glass once again, a mocking smile already forming. His voice cut through the room with that forced charisma he'd perfected over years of boardroom victories and courtroom threats. "To Venora," he said, holding his glass high, "who proves that no matter how far you fall, you can always land on someone else's back." What was his name again? Darren? Damon? Oh, right. Draven. A fine man, I'm sure. Though not quite one of us. Laughter rippled through a few clusters of guests, half-hearted, more awkward than amused, but Orville only grinned wider, emboldened by even the smallest chuckle. He had just insulted my late husband. The man who stood beside me when I had no one, who gave my daughter her calm eyes, her sense of right and wrong, who died too young, never knowing the truth about my birthright, or that the family I came from would someday use his name like dirt beneath their shoes. My chair scraped softly against the marble as I stood. I didn't rush, I didn't make a scene, but the sound, the unexpectedness of it, was enough to draw all eyes to me. I looked at Orville, then let my gaze sweep across the faces in the room. Some turned away, some waited, curious. Lucasta looked pale, blinking faster than usual. Her fingers fidgeted with the base of her wineglass. Orville leaned back smugly, as if daring me to speak. So I did. "You've built an empire of glass, Orville," I said, my voice even, steady. "The louder you speak, the more fragile it sounds." Silence. Even the servers paused mid-step. Someone at the far end cleared their throat. Another guest shifted uncomfortably. You could feel it, that sudden awareness that maybe this wasn't just another awkward family gathering. Maybe this was something more. Lucasta forced a tight smile, but her hand trembled just slightly as she reached for her drink. Orville, meanwhile, laughed again, but it didn't land quite the same. "Careful, sister," he said, voice sharper now. "You wouldn't want to embarrass yourself in front of real power." This time, fewer people laughed. A woman near the buffet quietly excused herself. Another couple turned toward each other, pretending to engage in private conversation. I didn't need to reply. Not yet. I let the silence answer for me. I sat back down slowly, my back straight, my hands folded neatly on the linen tablecloth. My daughter looked up at me, her face unreadable, but her eyes said everything. She saw it. She understood. They had pushed too far, and something in me had clicked. Orville thought power meant volume, that whoever spoke the loudest, whoever insulted first, won. But I had learned something far more dangerous in my years outside this gilded cage. When you let a man build his platform on ego, he eventually climbs high enough to fall off it himself. Across the table, Orville tried to regain his footing. He started talking to a man seated beside him, something about property rights, oil shares, inheritance clauses, anything to pretend my words hadn't landed. But they had. He felt it. I saw it in his eyes. Lucasta wasn't doing much better. She avoided looking at me altogether now, choosing instead to fuss over her bracelet, pretending to admire the clasp like it was the first time she'd seen it. That was the thing about people like her. Cruelty came easy, but confrontation, not so much. I leaned slightly toward my daughter and whispered, "This is just noise, sweetheart. It only matters if we let it." She nodded, a quiet kind of strength settling into her shoulders. The rest of the evening unraveled slowly after that. People drank a little more. Conversations drifted back to surface-level topics, weather, art, the next charity gala. But something in the room had changed. The balance had shifted. Orville could feel it. So could Lucasta. And I wasn't angry anymore. Not the kind of anger that explodes and fades. This was deeper, calmer, intentional. Let them laugh. Every word they spit is a rope they're tying around their own neck. They believed I had no power, but their arrogance would be their undoing. The laughter didn't echo long, but the sting lingered. They thought I'd shrivel under it, that I'd retreat into the same silence I'd always carried like armor. But I'd felt it when I stood. Power. Not the kind they used, not the kind measured by applause or inheritance, but something older, realer. The moment I stood my ground, Orville decided he had to destroy me completely. It didn't take long. Minutes later, one of the servers tapped my shoulder and handed me a microphone, gesturing toward the small raised platform beside the fireplace. "They'd like you to say a few words," he whispered, almost apologetically. I didn't hesitate. I rose from my chair and walked toward the platform. I didn't have a speech prepared, but I knew what I wanted to say, or at least I knew what they needed to hear. I stepped up. The room quieted. I brought the mic to my lips. Nothing. I glanced at the mic, tapped it gently. Still nothing. Lucasta was across the room, her wineglass poised delicately in her hand, that familiar crooked smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She raised her eyebrows as if to say, "Oops." And just like that, the guests began murmuring, chuckling under their breath. "She doesn't need a mic to be invisible," someone said, loud enough for others to hear. I caught Orville leaning toward a man beside him, whispering something that made the man burst into laughter. The pit in my stomach deepened, but I stayed still. I placed the mic down on the podium gently, without reaction, then stepped away from it. My voice may not have filled the room just yet, but my silence did. And then Orville stood. He didn't take the stage. No need. His voice could command a room from any corner. "Well, I suppose some people let silence speak for them," he began, swirling his drink. "In Venora's case, maybe it's because she's run out of things to say. Or maybe There wasn't much there to begin with. The guests froze. He didn't stop. "Let's not forget," he said, pulling a small folder from his jacket. "Some people rise not on their own merit, but on the backs of others. My dear sister here, she married into money. And when that was gone," he flipped the folder open with exaggerated flair, "she stayed afloat, miraculously. Lavish condos, private schools, personal stylists, and yet no employment history, no assets of her own. How convenient." Gasps rippled across the room. My heart dropped, not because I was ashamed, because I knew what he was doing. Those weren't real records, they were forgeries, twisted half-truths designed to turn suspicion into fact. I didn't flinch, but inside something cracked. I looked toward my daughter. Her face was pale, eyes wide, staring at the folder like it was a loaded gun. This was no longer just about me. This was a warning shot meant to burn everything I had built since I re-entered their world. He wanted me gone, not just out of this estate, but out of the story entirely. Buried again. My vision blurred for a moment. I had stood in front of courtrooms and faced judges. I had walked into hospital rooms and told my child everything would be okay when it wasn't. But this humiliation, it felt heavier because I knew what was really behind it. Control. They didn't want truth. They wanted dominance, erasure. My return had disrupted the perfect illusion of their family, and Orville couldn't stand the cracks showing. I looked down at my clenched fists, the veins standing out beneath my skin. If I walk away now, I thought, I return to the shadow where they placed me. Then, out of nowhere, my foster mother's voice returned, clearer than it had in years. "Quiet water cuts deeper than waves." And just like that, I breathed. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I turned my eyes toward Orville and watched him bask in his moment, the way predators do when they think they've already won. But I wasn't broken. Not this time. They had taken my voice, twisted my past, targeted my child. But they hadn't taken me. This would be the last time they ever laughed at my silence. They thought they had buried me under shame. But all they had done was sharpen the blade I would use to cut them down. And then, at the height of their laughter, the double doors opened wide, and he walked in. Draven. The room shifted like someone had changed the air itself. The chatter died mid-breath. Forks froze mid-air. Every eye turned. My husband, tall and composed in a slate-gray suit, stepped forward without hesitation. His presence didn't ask for attention. It demanded it, not because of his fame or his power, but because he moved like a man who knew the game and had already won it. Orville's smirk faltered. Lucasta's wineglass shook just slightly, though she tried to play it off. Draven's eyes didn't scan the crowd. He looked only at me. He walked to where I stood near the platform, gently touched my arm, just enough to let me know I wasn't alone. Then he turned to face the room. The silence stretched, and then his voice, smooth and clear, sliced through it. "From this moment forward," he said, "anyone who does business with this family does not do business with me." Gasps spread like wildfire. Investors looked at each other, confused, rattled. A few stood up instinctively, unsure whether to stay or walk. No one laughed now. You could see the calculations happening behind every pair of eyes in that room. Cost, reputation, risk. The people who'd found amusement in my humiliation now saw a different kind of threat. Consequence. Orville stepped forward, trying to recover. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You think you can walk in here and—" But Draven didn't even look at him. Lucasta, lips twitching with panic, chimed in next. "She's nothing without him," she said, loud enough to draw attention back to me. "She always clung to powerful men like a leech. Venora's entire life is a performance, just like the ones he acts in." That was her last card. Discredit me, again. And then Orville slammed a folder onto the table. "Here," he barked. "Proof she's a fraud. Financial documents showing how she leached off Draven's companies. She's hiding behind his name. He flung open the folder, spreading its contents, obvious fakes to anyone who had seen real ledgers. But panic makes people believe anything. The room hovered on a knife's edge. I could have let Draven speak again, let him bury them for me. But this moment wasn't his to claim. It was mine. So I stepped forward. Slowly, steadily, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin, leather-bound folio. I opened it gently. No theatrics, no anger, just truth. "Since you're so concerned about my finances," I said calmly, "let me help you sleep tonight." Inside were copies of legal contracts, clear, notarized ownership of properties, investments, and equity shares, all under my name, all built before Draven and I ever met. I held up a printed record of a charitable trust in my late father's name. He'd established it for me, quietly, years before his death. And then came the final piece. I handed a small remote to the staff tech behind me. He hesitated, then clicked. A video began to play on the main screen behind us. It was grainy but clear, security footage from my father's study. He sat at his desk, looking straight at the camera, speaking to his attorney. His voice shook with age, but not with doubt. "If anything happens to me, let the world know the truth," he said. "My daughter Venora was lost to us by mistake, but she is my child, by blood and by heart. She is my legacy. I want her to inherit what was denied." Silence followed. I didn't cry. I didn't gloat. I closed the folio, placed it on the table, and beside it, I laid down the name card that had been misprinted earlier that night. "Guest," it had said. "Not anymore." Orville's face drained of color. Lucasta looked like she'd swallowed glass. One by one, guests began collecting their things. Several investors slipped out, whispering as they moved. In minutes, the foundation they'd used to shame me began to crack, and I didn't have to scream. I didn't need a microphone. I just needed the truth. I didn't stay to watch them unravel. I didn't need to. I turned to Draven. He took my hand, and together we stepped out of the hall, past the people who once ignored me, past the family who tried to erase me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the invisible daughter. I was the storm they never saw coming. The morning after the collapse, I sat alone at the edge of the garden behind the estate. The air was still damp from last night's rain, but the sky was open now, soft blue, with the light of a new day spilling through the trees. Their empire had crumbled in front of hundreds of witnesses. But my chest felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't sorrow, and it wasn't guilt. It was something more complex, like the quiet fatigue that settles in once a storm has passed and you're left staring at the wreckage, unsure whether to mourn it or be grateful it's over. By noon, the headlines were everywhere, online, on television, even whispered in the aisles of boutique cafes and private golf clubs. Deals were pulled, contracts retracted. Board members withdrew from the family's ventures like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Those who once praised Orville's ambition and Lucasta's poise now found themselves scrambling to delete old photos and distance their names. Not a single call came through to me from either of them, but I wasn't waiting for one. When I walked through the estate later that day, the hallways were empty. No staff, no buzzing conversation, just the lingering scent of expensive perfume and burnt-out pride. I passed the main dining room, where the long table still sat, untouched since last night. Half-drunk wine glasses, folded napkins, silence. I made my way to the head of the table. My name card was still there, the one they had printed for me when I arrived. It still read, "Guest." I stood for a moment, looking at it. Not with anger anymore, not even resentment. I picked it up, turned it over, then placed it back in the center of the table, right where Orville had sat. "They gave me the wrong name," I whispered. "But I know exactly who I am now." And with that, I turned and walked out. The lawsuits hit within hours. Investors who had poured millions into Orville's companies accused him of fraud, misrepresentation, and breach of contract. Some filed criminal complaints, others simply demanded their money back, loudly, and with lawyers. Lucasta's once glamorous circle, women who lunched and gossiped and traveled together in curated photo ops, stopped returning her messages. She went from the cover of luxury magazines to silence, not out of solidarity with me. No, they were just protecting themselves. Their downfall didn't need my hand. Their own arrogance did the work. That night, I took a walk with my daughter. We strolled the quiet street just outside the estate, the moonlight brushing over her cheeks as she held my hand, tighter than usual. "You didn't scream," she said after a while. "You didn't fight the way they expected." "I didn't need to," I told her. She looked up at me, eyes wide. "Because of Dad?" I shook my head. Because they were already destroying themselves. All I had to do was not join them. She nodded, quietly, and then I added, "Power built on cruelty always collapses, but dignity, that survives." She smiled. That shy, thoughtful kind of smile that only children can give, the kind that makes everything worth it. The rest of the week passed in soft silence. We didn't celebrate. There were no champagne corks, no victory speeches. But I did something I hadn't done in years. I slept deeply, without nightmares, without doubt. I didn't win because I married well. I didn't win because I had better lawyers or flashier clothes. I won because I refused to be silent one more time. Because even after 3 decades of being ignored, I never forgot who I was. They tried to make me feel invisible, but in the end, it was their voices that disappeared. And me? I walked forward, scarred, but whole. Sometimes the loudest revenge is simply walking away and letting them choke on the silence you leave behind.